Good morning and welcome to Rose Red Homestead, where today we are going to be talking about food security in a way that was requested by one of our viewers. She alerted me to a new study that was just published in January from the University of Michigan, and I have that study right here. So the study is comparing the carbon footprints of urban and conventional agriculture. The lead author is Jason Hawks, who is a doctoral student. This is a great feather in his cap. This is a fantastic study. So he'll not only have information for his dissertation, but he can do more studies along this line for the whole rest of his career. And this was done by the Sustainability School at the University of Michigan. And oh my goodness, what an impact or what a response this study has generated among a lot of people. And so she asked me, she said, tensions are so high and anger is so prevalent with the results of this study. Can you just take a look at it and share what you think? Well, I'm happy to do that. And actually, the title of this video is, Are Our Backyard Gardens, are our home gardens bad for the environment? And essentially, that's what this study answers or has collected data on. Most of the responses that I saw, and I've read the study, I've read some reviews of the study, and I've looked at some YouTube videos of people responding to the study. Most of the responses to the study are hair on fire, knee-jerk, and people are angry and they're ranting, and I'm thinking, what on earth? And what I have realized is that there are a lot of people who just jump to conclusions without a scientific experience that helps them relate to a study like this, to put it in proper perspective, and are quick to judgment. People will look at a headline and then skim the first few pages for a result and in numbers, and then boom, they're done reading. And then they respond to those numbers. Well, the numbers are not favorable toward our backyard gardens, but that's not the whole story of this paper. And so the people who have condemned this study in one way or another are not going to be happy with what I have to say about it. And that is just fine. It really pays when a study like this comes out, and I really do think this is going to be a landmark study historically, as it is the first study of its kind to measure the way that it measured what is called a carbon footprint. Now, what is a carbon footprint? We probably need to know that before we go much farther. A carbon footprint for anything is the amount of carbon dioxide that is put into the atmosphere as a result of some action or manufacturing process. There's a carbon footprint of this house. And that carbon footprint would be the amount of propane that we use, the amount of electricity that we use for heating and cooling and cooking and everything else. That can be measured because there are databases of the use or of the generation of carbon dioxide for many, many, many things. And so they used that information and created a fraction, a division problem, and we'll go over that in just a minute, to figure out the comparison between what they call urban gardens, and that included what we do, individually owned plots where people grow vegetables, or community collaboration that are run mostly by volunteers, or community gardens that a community pays a professional to manage, but it's very small term and very low tech. No hydroponics, no vertical gardening, just put the seed in the ground and do what you need to do to it, then harvest the result, and then that is low tech. Part of setting the stage to what I'm ultimately going to say about this study goes directly to the idea of exactly what is the nature of a scientific study and how does it contribute to the advancement of scientific knowledge. And that's one of the bottom lines for this study. This study is incredible in that it is starting us down a new path of things to measure. And so in a scientific study, the way that they are traditionally done is that the researchers will establish a hypothesis, and this is kind of, you might call it a best guess or best prediction, or a statement of what they hope to accomplish with the study. And then they will decide on what variables they are going to use and how to measure those variables. And a lot of times, the variables and how to measure them are already established by previous studies along the same vein. When you are plowing new territory, which this study does in a lot of ways, then your design team, your research design team, will establish a very logical way how to do that. And that can be very tricky, deciding on which variables. And I know that firsthand. I have been a researcher. I have done a significant study before that had over 300,000 data points. And we were introducing engineering curriculum into science classes in the middle school, and then we wanted to measure the impact of that on students' understanding of scientific concepts as they engaged in engineering learning activities. And as we sat around the table discussing the variables that we were proposing in order to get a grant to do this, which we were able to get, and it was a lot of fun, discussing the variables and figuring out which ones to learn to use in your study, that's huge. And so this study has been criticized widely because it didn't use this variable or that variable or whatever. Well, I get that. We need to put ourselves in the shoes of the researcher and understand that with any research project, you simply cannot measure every variable that there is. You can't. And you have to make choices, and those choices are based on best practice and also good, solid scientific sense. And there are limitations of funding. One of the things that prevents us from doing as expansive a study as we would like is that our funding is limited. We can only do so much. Our people power, that's another limitation. Our time constraints, that's another limitation. And my assessment of this study is I think they did a very remarkable job given all of the constraints that are in place for a study of this nature. I think that it was a pretty incredible. Now, I'm not speaking about the results. I'm speaking right now of the design of the study. And then what you do after you decide on the variables and how to measure them, then you collect the data. And you also have to decide how you are going to analyze, and you have to decide that in advance to know where you are headed once you get the numbers, because you can't cheat. Of course, people have cheated, but they usually are caught and then disgraced and fired by their university. So they collect and analyze the data, and then they interpret the results. So here are some things that I really liked about this study. I'm going to share these quickly, and then we're going to get into the study and actually what it measured. I really, really liked the comprehensive nature of this study. They did an amazing job and got into areas that had not yet been studied, and that's what is really a great impact of this study, is that they are plowing new ground. I also really appreciated their attention to accuracy and validity of their measurement. They were measuring the carbon footprint of various structures and things on all of these farms, on these urban farms. Urban means within cities. And so on these urban farms, if, for instance, our little homestead had been in this study, they might have come out and walked us through a few things on our property, because they did that. They visited all of these sites. They had 73 sites. And they might notice that out in one of our Vigo gardens, we had half of it planted in cucumbers and the other half in wildflowers. Well, the only half that was pertinent to this study was the half that was growing cucumbers. And so they used only the numbers for half of our raised bed that was growing half food and half ornamentals. So they were meticulous in their data collection, and I really appreciated that. They also used citizen scientists, and that is such a fun concept. I have loved this idea since I first learned about it about 3 decades ago. And that is, you use just regular, normal people to help you collect data for a scientific project. Now, a long time ago, when I was teaching middle school in the state of Washington, one of the universities was studying a new species of salamander that they had just identified. And they decided that they were going to enlist the help of citizen scientists at the middle school level. And so the notice went out to all of the middle schools in the state of Washington that if you wanted your kids to be, your students to be a part of this study, you could sign up. Well, I signed up in a heartbeat. And we got a little bit of training on how to recognize the salamander and where its habitat was and how to recognize males versus females. And then kids went home to their neighborhoods, looked in their backyards, looked at the places where they played. We even had a little study area that we were already working on where we just combed the area for the location of these salamanders. We located some, we took the data that we needed to, and then we sent that data back to the researchers. And my students were just thrilled to be considered citizen scientists that helped perform this scientific study. This study uses citizen scientists, normal people like us without scientific training, but who know their property and can make daily journal inputs on in terms of the data that the researchers wanted collecting. So I really liked that about it. And then one of the things that I thought flies in the face of a lot of the hair on fire knee-jerk folks was the idea that they are proponents of urban agriculture. They're not trying to stamp it out, but rather they recognize how important it is for these small farms nested within cities to the contribution of sustainability for those cities. And even though the results, which we'll get to in just a minute, showed that we don't have as good a carbon footprint in small farms like ours, for instance, as the commercial folks do, they still support the urban farms and want to make sure that we do the best job that we possibly can, and they have given some really good suggestions. So with that said, let's kind of get into the study just a little bit, and we'll talk about what they did and how they measured it. So one of the things that makes this study so comprehensive is that they worked with small-time farmers, urban farmers, in 5 countries, in France and Germany and Poland, and then in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And they talk about countries, that they worked with countries. Well, the assumption might be made that they did a lot of work across the countries, but that was not the case. So if there's one limitation, and they actually mentioned this, in the United States, they picked one city, and that was New York City. In the United Kingdom, they picked one city, and that was the city of London. So there were farms in New York, farms in London, and farms in small areas of the other 3 European countries for 73 different farms that they used. And it was a representative sample. So representative of a typical type of urban farm. And then they collected a lot of data from the farmers themselves. And so what they were doing is measuring the carbon footprint of all of those 73 farms. And they were comparing it to the amount of servings of food that were produced. So on my board here, I have written the fraction that they used. It was carbon dioxide inputs divided by the number of servings produced. So it's inputs divided by outputs. Now we do this kind of a fraction all the time. How many of us go to the grocery store? We may spend $120 on food for the week, and then we can divide that by 7 days. And what's our output? Our output is, so it's cost, and then it's the number of days, and then we can get the cost of food per day on average. So we do that kind of calculating all the time in our daily lives. And that's all this study did. It measured carbon dioxide as an input and divided it by the number of servings produced on that farm. And that gave them the carbon footprint. Now, carbon dioxide was measured in terms of its mass. Kind of think of mass as the same thing as weight. Well, how did they do that? Well, here's what they did. They kept track of the cost of infrastructure, of supplies, and irrigation water. So infrastructure, they looked at things like, do you have a shed on your property? Have you built pathways between your gardens? Do you have raised beds? What materials did you use for those raised beds? And they can go to the various databases that are already in place and figure out, for instance, we have 4 Vigo gardens. And many of you have seen our videos on our Vigo gardens. They're raised bed, big raised gardens. Well, what are they, Jim? About 3 by 5 or something.
Something like that.
Yeah. And so we paid X number of dollars for that. And they can figure out that when those were manufactured, how much carbon dioxide was put into the air for the manufacture of one of those gardens. And then that amount of carbon dioxide would go as part of our carbon footprint because we brought it onto our farm. And so it's infrastructure, it's sheds, it's if you pour concrete to help, if you build a fence, if you put up a greenhouse, any of these, it was measured not in cost of money, but in cost of the carbon dioxide that was put into the atmosphere for the production, the original production of that item, whatever it was. And then supplies. So what supplies would you bring into your farm? Well, supplies that we have purchased and brought into our farm would be our soil amendments. We just spent some money on soil that is good for, it's a potting soil mix that is good for raised beds, and we bought some composted steer manure. So the expense of that in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide that went into the atmosphere is then charged against us. It goes up on our numerator of this fraction right here. So it's all kinds of supplies that you would need: seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, whatever it is that you use for the gardens. And then your irrigation water in terms of the electricity that is used for pumping irrigation water or whatever. These were the broad categories of the inputs that were measured in terms of the carbon dioxide. Then they collected data on the biomass of food, the poundage of food that was produced after carrots were peeled, after potatoes were peeled, the amount of food that was produced in these gardens, and then they did their math. And when they did their math and then averaged all of the 73 sites that they did, here are the results. So for urban agriculture, the amount of carbon dioxide per serving was 420 grams per serving. For conventional agriculture, in other words, commercial agriculture, it was 70 grams per serving. Okay, so you can see there's quite a difference here. And so urban gardens have a carbon footprint that is 6 times the amount of a carbon footprint that commercial agriculture produces. And that is the number, the comparison of those two numbers, it is what set people's hair on fire. But you didn't count this and you didn't count that and you forgot about this. Well, no, they didn't. They selected the variables that they could measure with the greatest efficiency and effectiveness that pertained to their study. They recognized that there were other variables that could have been worked into this, but the thing that we need to remember is that this is the first study that is done that measures this. And no one knows the limitation of a study better than the researchers. Ask me how I know that. As we were performing our study, we thought, oh, I should have thought about this, or we could have thought about this, or next time if we repeat this, I'm going to do this a little bit differently. Well, all of those thoughts about the limitations of the study went into my paper. I mentioned those just like they do. They had 6 or 7 things that they said should be followed up on future studies, which is a great thing. And so as more studies come forward, we're not gonna base our whole future life on the results of one study. It's a baby step. It is a baby step in the accumulation of scientific knowledge that is built over time, one drop in the bucket at a time. And so this is one study, and it gives us important information, but it is not 100% conclusive, and that's the way it is, boom, end of story. It's the beginning of the story. It's the first few pages of an entire book. And we're going to learn more and more as other researchers take on this pathway and figure out different ways to measure things. So pretty soon we're going to have a whole body of knowledge that really suggests these, and will change these numbers with every study. But there are some really good takeaways for us from this study. The fact that the carbon footprint of most urban farms is larger based on the way that they measured it is a wake-up call for us. And I appreciate, this is a piece of information that is really good for us, because those of us who do urban farming, we can do better. And they even suggest 3 ways that we can do better. The first way is to extend infrastructure lifetimes. One of the things that happens with urban farms is they get bought and sold a lot, and a new person comes in and wipes out what the previous person had done, puts in their own new stuff, buys new stuff, and there the carbon footprint goes up again. When in reality, with these Vigo gardens, we have 4 of them. We've been using them now, Jim, 3 years? This will be our 3rd, maybe 4th year. And we're going to stay on this property until we kick the bucket. And then I don't know what our children will do, but maybe one of them may move into this house. The longer those Vigo gardens stay in place out there, the more reduction occurs in the carbon footprint. So the longer we can keep things in operation, the more we can diminish our carbon footprint. So that's one thing that we can do. We can all do better about taking good care of the things that we have, so that we don't have to go off and buy new things all the time. Then the second one, which was really important, was using urban waste as agriculture inputs. Now, what that means is save your rainwater, do composting, build your raised beds with pallet wood instead of buying them brand new the way we did. So there are lots of different ways that we can use recycled materials that somebody else has already paid the carbon footprint cost for it. We bring it onto our farm, and it doesn't cost us a thing. And so one of the things that they suggested was that municipalities need to do a better job by making things, helping certain industries like the construction industry create ways where people who are doing urban gardening can get things like sawdust and wood scraps and metal scraps and whatever, so that they can recycle. And then the other thing is to do our own composting, because we create a lot of waste. And then if we do composting correctly, well, one farm in their study reduced their carbon footprint by 40% simply by doing composting the right way. Now, we need to be careful with composting, because composting can also put additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we need to learn how to do composting correctly, then implement that, and then we can reduce our carbon footprint. Another farm in their study, back to infrastructure, reduced their carbon footprint by over 52%. Because they used recycled materials to put up some sheds and other things. So there are ways that we can conserve and reduce our carbon footprint. And Jim and I are going to be more mindful of it. Our property, we have a ton of great big trees, and they produce so many leaves. And so we can figure out ways that those little leaves are little sunshine packets, and we can figure out ways that we can do leaves better and use them as part of the input, which would reduce our carbon footprint by quite a bit. Then there is another thing that they said, and they start even in the very first part of their study. The first paragraph acknowledges that there is strong evidence of social and nutritional benefits from urban farms. And the social and nutritional benefits were not taken into consideration in this study because that's not what they went after. Those don't have an impact on carbon footprint. But if you look at things with a broader lens, more holistically, then the social benefits and the dietary nutritional benefits will, let me just read it to you. Urban farmers and gardeners overwhelmingly reported improved mental health, improved diet, and improved social networks. While these do not reduce its carbon footprint, growing spaces which maximize social benefits can outcompete conventional agriculture when those benefits are considered holistically, which means that you broaden the lens just a little bit. There are other benefits to doing urban gardening than just a measure of carbon footprints. And so the things that are very beneficial to those of us that grow our own food are improved health. And gardening itself is invigorating, and so mental health is good, physical health is great. And then our social networks, when we take a load of our stuff to the farmer's market, we have conversations with a lot of people, we build community. That's all part of the social benefits that can be considered. And the authors pretty much end their study by saying, urban farming is a very important part of sustainability of cities. So while there are a lot of these social benefits, we want to improve the carbon footprint, and we can do that. And so this is not the horrible, horrible outcome study that a lot of people think it is. There's a lot of really good information. It was a good study, and so I'm very pleased with this study. It gave us some really good information, things that we can work on. So I hope that helps. I don't think anybody's going to be giving up their urban gardening as a result of this study. Nobody wants anybody to give up urban gardening because of the results of this study. This is a baby step in a new direction. And I, for one, am really looking forward to more studies along this same light that will shed even more light on this so that we can do better. We all, as far as I know, all of us want to preserve the planet for generations to come, and we can do that through sustainable living as much as possible. And this is one little step that we have pretty much good control over in our own homes. So thank you. I hope this was beneficial. I hope those of you that were really concerned about the study can feel better about it, knowing that it's just a drop in the bucket and we still have a long way to go before there's anything super definitive that we can really hang our hat on. In the meantime, we have a direction that we can go to help improve things currently. So thank you so much for joining me for this little bit of a science explanation of this study. And I hope it was helpful for you. So we will see you again very soon for another video.